We'll just give it another minute or so. And in the meantime, if you just want to make sure that you are muted, just so that we have a clear meeting as it's being recorded.
Yep.
Okay, so I think we should get started. Just letting a few more in the waiting room here. All right, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final public meeting as part of the 3 Mile Lake Causation Study. Thanks so much for joining on this morning and for your interest in this project over its entire course. Before we get too far into the meeting, I just want to ensure that everyone is aware that the meeting is being recorded and it will be made available on the district's Engage Muskoka website so that folks who couldn't join today still have the opportunity to watch and learn and provide feedback. If you have any feedback to provide, you are welcome to share that at the end of this forthcoming presentation, or you can share that with me directly. So with that, my name is Cassie Ems. I'm a planner here at the District of Muskoka, and I'm also your point person for the causation studies. I'd just like to kick off this meeting with a quick backgrounder of causation studies, as it's been quite some time since we've all been together. Causation studies are initiated in accordance with the Muskoka official plan when a lake experiences one of 3 water quality indicators, one of which being the occurrence of a blue-green algae bloom. The purpose of causation studies is to identify why the lake experienced the water quality indicator. And in this case, 3 Mile Lake was chosen for this study based on the history of algae blooms, and also because it has high development potential, because of the Lake Association has been very highly engaged and also invested considerable resources, and the Lake Association is involved in a variety of water quality initiatives. There is also a very decent database on this lake, which this study will build upon. There are 4 other causation studies currently being done, and while the results of each study will be unique and carefully looked at on a lake-by-lake basis, we also have the opportunity to see if there are any trends or patterns about how water quality is being affected across the watershed. The district, the 3 Mile Lake Association, and other stakeholders are key players in this project. And like you all, district staff are looking forward to this presentation to learn about the results and recommendations and how the results can inform our land use or development planning policies. Ultimately, we want to ensure that the outcomes of this study and other concurrent studies can be successfully implemented at the policy and program level. So now let's move on to the quick introductions. If we can hit next slide there, please, Chris. I'd just like to introduce you all to the project team. On the line today, we have Chris Hadley and Beverly Saunders. Dr. Christopher Hadley joined Hutchison Environmental Sciences as an NSERC Industrial Research and Development Fellow in 2013 after completing a postdoctoral fellowship at the Ontario Ministry of Environment and PhD at Queen's University. Chris has worked on a wide array of projects on lakes in Muskoka, Haliburton region since 2008. Beverly is the planning supervisor at EcoView Consulting Services. She has 12 years of experience in environmental and land use planning, as well as policy analysis and development. This includes 4 years of leading watershed planning efforts driven by stakeholder concerns, which were identified through workshops, public meetings, surveys, and one-on-one consultation. Beverly currently works on both private and municipal land use planning projects with a focus on leading work which involves stakeholder engagement and environmental impact issues. Beverly has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science and a Master's of Science in Aquatic Resources with a past research focus on consensus-based watershed planning. Colleagues of mine here at the district that have been involved in the study and who are also on the line today include Elizabeth Purcell, Manager of Planning, and Rebecca Willison, Watershed Planning Technician. And lastly, but most importantly on our project team are the stakeholders. We have relied on the participation of stakeholders throughout the entirety of this project, and that remains true as we approach the final stages of the project. Thank you to all the stakeholders so far, whether you're a lake association member or if you live, work, or play on the lake, you have all provided valuable input to help us gain an understanding of the current and past conditions of the lake. So again, thank you for helping us gather information, for your interest in the study, and thank you in advance for providing your feedback on the forthcoming draft report and presentation. So without further ado, over to you, Beverly. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassie. I'll just stay on this slide for a moment just to clarify roles. So EcoView was put in place to help with the consultation component of this project and to draft the consultation report that will be included in the draft report. Hutchinson is the primary consultant on the file. They are doing the full scientific analysis associated with the causation study and will be presenting for the majority of this presentation. Next slide, please. This is just housekeeping. So the chat function is open on this call. We will be monitoring that throughout the presentation. We have muted everyone on the call and will continue to do so through the presentation just to allow Chris to get through the full presentation. And so hopefully that answers some of your questions. That said, if you have questions and you're worried you're going to forget it or something like that, feel free to type your questions into the chat feature. I will be monitoring it. I'll be avoiding interrupting Chris's presentation to the greatest extent possible, but certainly if there's something that has to be clarified in that moment, I can certainly add that in or ask Chris to clarify. That said, once we open up for questions, which I'll talk about in a little bit, I'm happy to go through what was brought up in the different presentations or during the presentation. So you will be muted throughout the presentation, but then we will have the question and answer period where you will be able to come on video and answer your question verbally or as discussed, provided in the chat function if you're not comfortable providing it verbally. I'll give a bit of a brief overview of how that should go once we do the Q&A. But ideally, you're also just letting us know who you are and your interest in the lake with respect to before you provide those questions. It's also really helpful if you are able to direct message myself, Beverly Saunders, to let me know your interest in the lake. We are, and your name, and then we are just keeping a tally of everything so that can go into the consultation report. And as was said, we are recording this presentation and we will be transcribing and making sure all of the information that's provided is also addressed in the consultation report. Just so everyone knows, there is a reaction symbol at the bottom of the Zoom meeting, which includes a raising of hands. So anytime that you do want to speak during the Q&A, I'll remind you at that time, but that is the way to let me know, and I'll try to go in order of when I see those hands. Next slide, please. So today, it's primarily presentation by Hutchinson, although we will go over progress to date and then hand it over to him. And at the very end, we'll just talk about next steps in terms of finalizing this report. And then we'll go to the Q&A that I talked about earlier. Next slide, please. So progress to date, there was a startup meeting at the beginning of this project, including the consultants in the district where we were planning the project and determining the consultation process. There was a receipt of the data and information that the district already had that was provided to both ourselves and to Hutchinson. My apologies. And then that information was reviewed and initial data gaps were identified to help inform the scope of the study. This included past data, existing data, confirmation of information that was provided by stakeholders prior to the project. There was a first stakeholder meeting on April 20th, 2021, which, as was noted earlier, was posted on Engage Muskoka and is available for reference today. Next slide. After that, we did a survey on the lake, and the survey results were compiled and also posted on Engage Muskoka in July 2021. Data collection and fieldwork occurred in 2021 and 2022. Specifically, fieldwork occurred in 2021 and ongoing data collection through 2021 and 2022. There's been some discussions in the past, but there was a delay in obtaining data that was required to complete the analysis, and that was resulted in a delay in the project, which I'll go over in a little bit. We have completed a first draft of the report, but are waiting to release it until the end of this meeting because we want to ensure that the initial results are communicated to you and that any comments that we've received that may have a substantial impact on the report are considered, and also so that this stakeholder meeting can be included in the consultation component of the report. Right now, we're at the second stakeholder meeting. So this is the final sort of presentation directly to the public regarding the causation study, where we discuss the results with stakeholders. There will, however, be an opportunity for additional comments, which I'll go over in a moment. And furthermore, the district will be making the decision of whether these studies have to be moved forward to council. And in that case, if it does move forward to council, those meetings are recorded and will also be available for review. Next slide, please. So this is just the revised timeline that I was talking about. So this slide was in the original presentation. The delay is approximately 1 year. So originally it was due in early 2022, but due to the data delays has been extended. So after this meeting, we're proposing to have the draft report to you within 1 week of this meeting, and then allowing a commenting period, and then seeking to complete the report by early January for the district's consideration. Next slide, please. So this is just a brief overview of the consultation. I know there was a number of consultation points, information that was provided, but this is just to briefly go over the consultation plan that was involved and what occurred. So there was the initial stakeholder meeting and associated feedback, and that information was recorded and provided to Hutchinson, who reviewed that in scoping the assessment, determining what the next steps were. There was a significant amount of past and ongoing emails sent to the district, as well as past studies. And again, all of those correspondences were forwarded on to us and used, referenced, or incorporated into the study results, and especially used to help identify conclusions. Then there was a public survey and many photos that were also submitted. And again, all of those were provided to Hutchinson and to ourselves, and all of those were reviewed. And then that public survey, as I said, was summarized and posted on Engage Muskoka. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Chris, just so everyone knows he will be speaking to how some of the information that was provided in those consultation components was used. And further information will be provided in the report as well. So with that, thank you, Chris, and I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Beverly. So I wanted to start with just quickly going over the background of the causation study process, the framework that we developed for Peninsula Lake. I'll go through the results that we were able to analyze from the data that we gained along each line of evidence that we explored, and then present some of our conclusions based upon those data. So the goal of the project was to use the framework that was developed for Peninsula Lake in order to try and establish causes and contributing factors that are impacting water quality and causing cyanobacterial blooms, recurring cyanobacterial blooms in 3 Mile Lake. And that was focused through a very specific lens for this project, which was that of development, because this is a planning impact study under the Muskoka official plan. The official plan requires the causation studies, and the goal of those causation studies is to determine the causation, but also with a specific focus on development impacts. Is development impacting the lake based on the evidence that's available to an extent that that is scientifically defensible and measurable? So the scope of our study looked at the weight of evidence approach that we developed for Peninsula Lake, and I'll go over that in more detail in a moment. Considered multiple lines of evidence across cyanobacterial history on the lake, across climate data, across water quality data, past studies that have been looked at, as Beverly mentioned. So I compiled and reviewed all of the existing information that was provided to me by the district and by the stakeholders through the district. Did a historical data review. I'm not going to cover all of that material in this talk because there's a lot of it and we would be here for a very long time. But I did review shoreline reports. I reviewed septic system summaries. I reviewed photographs that were provided by stakeholders, the survey data, everything that came in I reviewed and used as I could to supplement the scientific data, the water quality data, the and other previous analyses that have been done on the lake. I also looked at some papers that have been published or some unpublished paper data that's been pending publishing on the lake. And I'll talk about that throughout as well. We did a very brief field program. I'll talk about that when the time comes. Our focus of the field program was late fall in order to look at dissolved oxygen concentrations, specifically in the main bay, because Hamels Bay anoxia is pretty well documented and known at this point. We did measure there just to for completeness sake, but what we were really focusing on was trying to look at gathering additional information on the main basin. And so I'll talk about the outcome of that nearer the end of the presentation. I looked at the phosphorus budget for the lake through the district's water quality model, which splits the lake into Hamels Bay and the main bay. The main sources of phosphorus that are contributing to the lake, and try to break those down in some detail in terms of things that could be managed versus natural sources and internal loading sources and that sort of thing. So I'll discuss that as well. And then also I'll be highlighting some areas where information that would have been useful wasn't available and going over that. So the weight of evidence approach. What we were looking at for the weight of evidence approach was a assessment of the main contributing factors that are known to lead to the proliferation of cyanobacteria in lakes in Ontario. Some of that is the ecology of the species themselves, which I'll cover briefly before I get into the more data-heavy evidence. Climate variables, wind speed, and temperature were the main focus because those are where our data sets are the richest. And also I looked at obviously water quality data, and based on those key factors, we tried to come up with lines of evidence that we could explore with the data that we had available. So what that looks like, I'm just gonna skip 2 slides. Yeah, sorry. That slide always lags and sends me further forward than it's supposed to. There we go. So what that looks like is, as a flow chart, is we have our lines of evidence at the top of this figure, which is all of the sort of data that was coming in, whether it's anecdotal information and photos on where the algae blooms occurred, when they occurred, how long they occurred for, that sort of thing. Water chemistry data, historical nutrient data, chemistry, toxin data, which was limited, and other general chemistry data, and then climate history. So changes in temperature, changes in wind speed, changes in precipitation, that sort of thing. And then we did a brief field program, as I mentioned. So our goal with these data was to look at how they related to, how these data in blue and orange related to the algal bloom history that we could reconstruct. So was there a change in water chemistry that could be assigned to the emergence and recurrence of algae blooms in the lake? And based upon those assessments through multiple lines of evidence, was there an indication that pointed to one specific or several specific causes or a most important cause of cyanobacteria blooms in the lake? So I'll go over each of the lines of evidence that are highlighted in the columns here. I've grouped them biologically, more water chemistry based, and then climate. I'll go through the biological ones first, and then the water chemistry ones, and then finish off with the climate ones. Keep in mind that we're looking at this through the lens of of development. So we want to relate this information to development wherever possible, because determining the cause of the algae blooms is certainly a goal, but one of the things that we want to do for the official plan and for planning policy is to be able to, as Cassie mentioned earlier, relate this back to development policy at the end of the day, and needs for change in development policy, and actions that can be taken in the watershed in order to, if possible, in order to prevent future cyanobacterial blooms. So I want to jump into the ecology briefly first of the main blooming species on 3 Mile Lake, because there's a lot of blooms. They're recurring. They're almost every single year to varying scopes and scales. But Dolichospermum, which used to be called Anabina, is the primary bloom species that occurs in 3 Mile Lake. It occurs almost every single year. We noticed several years where there was Gliotrichia blooms. Gliotrichia blooms are very common in oligotrophic lakes, pardon me. In the Muskoka area, it's the bloom species that was the primary bloom species on Peninsula Lake. We've seen it on some of the other lakes that causation studies have occurred for, and these three, and Aphanizomenon was co-occurring with Dolichospermum in several years, so I've included it as well. These three genera of algae have several unique strategies, life cycle strategies, that are very important in terms of determining their ability to outcompete other algae. The first is gas vacuoles, which allow them to control their buoyancy in the water column. And I'll discuss why that's important when I get to reviewing some of the data that reflects changes in those properties of the lake, of the 3 Mile Lake. A major factor that all three of these genera of cyanobacteria can do is they can all form resting stages. So they have complex life cycles, and one of those life cycle stages is the ability to create resting stages when conditions are not optimal. And those resting stages are called aconites, and those aconites will settle out into the sediment, and they will sit in the sediment until they germinate. And the germination of those aconites has been extensively studied, particularly for Gliotrichia, less so for Dolichospermum, but there is some indication in the literature that they might behave similarly. So I'm going to be pointing that out throughout and using them interchangeably, but the literature is much stronger for Gliotrichia than it is for Dolichospermum on aconites specific. But it's lake-wide variables that are believed to trigger aconite germination, and that germination tends to occur several weeks or a month prior to an algae bloom occurring or cyanobacterial bloom occurring on the lake. And that germination usually will result in those cells then sitting on the sediment. And in the case of Gliotrichia, that they have complex nutrient strategies, which allows those seed banks, those aconites, to draw phosphorus actively from the sediment before they get mixed into the water column and ultimately create a bloom. And it's that property that makes some of these aconite forming cyanobacteria so difficult to manage. And it's very important to the considerations when we look at what's changed in the lake and how that's affected cyanobacteria blooms. So I want to make sure that everybody sort of has that foundational understanding of how these cyanobacteria behave. They're also capable of fixing atmospheric nitrogen, which gives them a distinct advantage over other algae that can't do so when nitrogen becomes limiting, as it is in most lakes, particularly a lake with internal loading like 3 Mile Lake has, and with high enough phosphorus, nitrogen can being able to fix nitrogen to have nitrogen sources that other algae don't have is very beneficial. The algal bloom history, or the cyanobacterial bloom history on 3 Mile Lake, is the best documented one I've seen so far, which was very helpful. So this was pieced together from everything largely that was sent to me. So that is photographs from a lot of different stakeholders and emails communicating between those stakeholders and the district, emails from the MECP to the district and back again, so long email chains when sampling was occurring. The first documented bloom that I'm aware of on 3 Mile Lake was the big surface scum that occurred in 2005. And so that's the top picture on the right. And that was a large surface scum. It triggered MECP research, 2-year study program, and a lot of active monitoring on the lake. There has been recurring algae blooms based on MECP's long-term documentation almost every single year since. There is paleo record evidence that's been collected but not published. And so there's down core, I have limited information available on this, but there is down core counts of aconites, those resting stages that I was talking about, that do suggest that that there was possibly bloom events. They saw aconite spikes in the sediment in 1943 and 1990, and that's based on archives in sediments. So collecting sediment cores, looking down core, and then trying to reconstruct information on the lake. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. And the best records of the blooms I had were from 2015 to 2021. And I think that that's largely just because people have become more and more informed, more and more active in lake management through stewardship practices, through engagement with the district. And so there's a lot of photographic evidence, and there's a lot of detail in those emails about when algae growth is starting and when full bloom is occurring. So I'll try and cover some of that, but I have focused for the paper, for the report, I cover all of the main years that I have sufficient data for, but for the purposes of this, I've focused on several years to highlight key points that I wanted to look at. So the extent of the blooms based upon that research was fairly consistent. There was strong indications in Hamels Bay of nearshore cyanobacterial growth so that would be within a few meters of the shore oftentimes. That growth is usually precedes a larger bloom by a few weeks. And then that bloom expands in the deep water. So there's descriptions in those anecdotal reports of the Hamels Bay turning from blue, black to green, and then sometimes associated with dates, which was very helpful. So I looked at those specific dynamics related to the variables that we were looking at, but it's also helpful to understand that very much follows what we would expect for the ecology of the cyanobacteria that are blooming, that they would begin to develop from those seed banks in the near shore, and then they would eventually mix into the lake and full bloom. And then the differences between when you get a surface scum and when you don't get a surface scum, like 2005, is likely to be climate-based, but we'll dig into that a little bit more. One of the reasons from a development perspective we look at location and extent of blooms is because from a development perspective, if we're seeing isolated blooms that are only occurring in one spot repeatedly, that might point to a nearshore phosphorus, a local phosphorus source. That nearshore sampling might help control maybe a point source or something like that. That does not appear to be the case in 3 Mile Lake. So in the case of 3 Mile Lake, we don't have any evidence that there's, based on the bloom history, that there's those nearshore blooms, recurring nearshore blooms in the same place. So the X's here are basically to indicate what I just said, which is that the bloom frequency since that first bloom hasn't so much increased as it's been consistent. So there's nothing that would suggest that a recent occurrence in the lake, a recent development in the lake triggered that initial bloom. There's nothing in the location or the extent of the blooms being lake-wide blooms that suggest that development is the likely cause. The blooms didn't start until 2005. The development has on the lake has been significant for much longer than that. So based on those data, we don't believe that there's evidence to suggest that development is likely the leading cause of the blooms. So next, I want to look at the water quality component. So our field program was in late fall. So we sampled both Hamels Bay and the main basin in late fall. We also did bloom sampling in during the active bloom in 2021, which is in the report, but which you'll be able to review in the report. But for time, I didn't include the actual bloom sampling in this in the presentation today. The sampling was at the end of the stratified season. We were targeting the end of the stratified season in order to try and target the main basin and determine whether or not internal loading was a significant factor in the nutrient concentrations. There had been limited evidence that that internal loading was a factor in the main basin because the main basin is so shallow. And because that basin is very, very long, it's got quite a large fetch, so it's likely that it does not take a lot of wind to mix that water. And so it's a polymictic system, but in some polymictic systems, you can still get anoxia, and it's important to know what role that might be playing and gather information on what role that might be playing in the phosphorus dynamics of the lake. In addition to so during that sampling period, we sampled for pH, conductivity, temperature, and dissolved oxygen with depth throughout the water column. We looked at general chemistry, nutrients, and metals, and in anoxic conditions, which are almost always occurring on that lake, we also did a bottom water sample in order to try and determine the how internal loading was impacting the phosphorus concentrations in the lake. So looking at the dissolved oxygen profiles, this dissolved oxygen profile that I'm showing here is not from that fieldwork, so this is a historical one. As I mentioned earlier, hypolumnitic anoxia in Hamels Bay has been well established. The main basin goes anoxic in Hamels Bay quite early in the season, usually late June or in July. And as much as, and I'll show this on the next slide, as much as 10 meters of water in the main basin is almost completely anoxic in the hypolumnion, which leads to significant internal loading, which has been documented by the MECP, and we documented here as well. This particular profile is from the main basin, and it is what led me to want to get a later profile from the main basin as part of our research, and that is showing MECP data from 2015 in July, which shows an anoxic or a nearing anoxic profile in below 2 micrograms per liter dissolved oxygen in the bottom water, 1 meter off of the bottom in the main basin. And it was the only instance of all of the recorded dissolved oxygen profiles in the lake where we saw a dip below 2 micrograms per liter, but it suggested to me that periodic anoxia within the main basin could potentially be an important contributing factor to cyanobacterial blooms or to phosphorus release into the basin, which might feed cyanobacterial blooms. So our fall data did confirm periodic anoxia within the main basin. So on the left figure here, you see Hamels Bay, which is as I described. You've got 5 meters of anoxic water or near anoxic water at the bottom of Hamels Bay. So it's strongly stratified, and the oxygen is heavily depleted, as is typical. And then in the East Basin, we did capture non-anoxia, but again, the potential for anoxia, because we do see below 2 micrograms per liter of dissolved oxygen in the East Basin. So that would have been near Bethencock Island. So periodic anoxia is certainly a factor both in Hamels Bay, and we believe, based on the evidence we've collected. Now, these are 2 points. We have 2 points in time that show the potential for anoxia in the main basin, one in 2015 and one in 2021. They're obviously limited by the evidence that we have available, and the problem with periodic anoxia in shallow water like that is it's very difficult to be there right before a lake turns over. Normally, when we're looking for anoxia in deeper water, we know that the later we wait and fall, as long as the lake hasn't turned over, the more likely we are to find it, like in Hamels Bay. Here, if the lake is turned over and you don't time it right, you can potentially miss it. And so monitoring, consistent monitoring or high frequency monitoring using data loggers is usually better at capturing that. But we did find the evidence that we were looking for that suggests periodic anoxia is a factor in the main basin. What we didn't see based on any of the results that we have directly from oxygen concentrations is that there was any reason to believe that that anoxia pattern had changed over time related to development. So we didn't see any more frequent. I didn't show all of the dissolved oxygen data. There is a large number of profiles that are in the report, but I didn't want to just put 50 oxygen graphs up here. So there is a large number of dissolved oxygen profiles for Hamels Bay, which show that the anoxia that's occurred there has been occurring since the monitoring record began in the 80s and 90s. And there's no indication that it's occurring more frequently now than it was then. So for that reason, there's no documented increase in anoxia. The next thing I'll look at quickly is the monitoring data, long-term total phosphorus, before I cover the paleo data total phosphorus. So on the right-hand side is the Lake Partner Program data, which is less long-term and sort of more variable in terms of not only the concentrations, but when it was collected. So I've included it for completeness to show that there's no significant increases in any of the bays that have been measured over the duration of the monitoring record, keeping in mind that that monitoring record in some cases only began in 2005. The Hamels Bay and Main Basin data that was available from the district's own data is summarized on the left. And this is just to show that during the modern period monitoring record, there is no indication that phosphorus concentrations have increased over time. So there's nothing that occurred in 2005 that would suggest that there's a spike in phosphorus from development that might have initiated that and that first bloom. We can't say definitively that development did not have an impact. Obviously, we don't have the data for that, but what we can say is that there's nothing in the nutrient data to suggest that land clearance in the area or development in the area drove those blooms to occur based on the data we have available. Looking longer term, so there has been paleo work done on the lake. It was done, I believe, back in 2006 or 2007. And that data reconstructed phosphorus in the lake over a much longer period of time using lake sediments. So just a brief synopsis of paleo data and paleo data collection: collecting a sediment core from the deep spot of the lake and sectioning it. And each one of those sediment sections is basically a page in a book. And those, the information that is stored in that sediment, whether it's the chemistry information or biological information through preserved fossils, which is what's being used here, can be used to reconstruct variables like total phosphorus. So here what's been done is a reconstruction going back to the mid-1800s of total phosphorus in the main basin of 3 Mile Lake. And you can see that between 1860 and 1900, there is a significant increase in total phosphorus, in modeled total phosphorus, inferred total phosphorus in the lake. Keep in mind there are error bars associated with these data points. It's not an exact science, so it doesn't necessarily mean the concentration of phosphorus in 1900 was exactly 27 micrograms per liter. That's just the estimate based upon the models, the model data. That sort of an increase could be indicative of land clearance and therefore could be indicative of a development signal, but does not link to anything that we know about cyanobacterial blooms. So the first known cyanobacterial bloom in the lake occurred in 2005. And the paleocyano data that I mentioned earlier, which was the work of Liz Favat, who was at Queen's University and is now with the MECP, their data, based on what I was able to receive of it, suggests that approximately 1943 and approximately 1990 were periods of time when they saw spikes in cyanobacterial aconites in the sediment. And that does not correspond with the total phosphorus data increasing or anything that would suggest that those peaks were driven by development. And these dates, because paleo data dating down core is subject to significant error, like a few years of error, usually plus or minus 5 years. I can't really compare climate records directly with those dates because obviously we can't reconstruct the blooms the same way we can with your guys' information from the lake. And I'll also add that the concentrations during the recent recurring blooms have occurred during what have been some of the lowest phosphorus concentrations on record. So when you look at the reconstruction, you see that there's been a significant decline, and some of that is related to phosphates being removed from detergents in the 70s. Some of that is likely related to better lake management and septic system management and policies that are put in place in terms of development that helps lower phosphorus concentrations. So looking at the phosphorus budget, so while there's no recent changes in the monitoring or in the paleo data that show changes in TP concentrations that might explain the bloom, we did want to look at and review phosphorus sources that could influence cyanobacterial dynamics. So where's the phosphorus in the lake coming from based upon the model data that we have? Gliotrichia, as I mentioned earlier, does take up a lot of sediment a lot of phosphorus, from the sediment. Dolichospermum, we think that might also be an important mechanism, but it's not as well documented. So the overland runoff component, which is a big part of development in a watershed. So overland runoff is going to be water that is falling on the land and draining directly into the lake over the surface. When you deforest a catchment, when you cut things down for agriculture, for cottage development, for any urban development, some of that is inevitably replaced with impervious surfaces that don't soak up that water as well. So whether it's lawns or driveways or just houses that have downspouts that shoot the water straight through their drainage systems and into the lake, it creates an easier pathway for the rainwater to the lake. That rainwater rushing over lawns that are fertilized is going to potentially pick up phosphorus and deposit it directly into the lake. So that's a significant factor in terms of determining in terms of phosphorus sources to the lake, as well as internal loading and septic systems. So I'll talk about those briefly now. Based on the shoreline report that was done in 2016, there are 611 properties surveyed on 3 Mile Lake. 462 of those were identified as could benefit from shoreline naturalization, and 48 of those 462 excuse me, were described as top priority. 147 of the properties that were surveyed had lawns mowed straight to the water's edge. And so there was definitely potential for reduction of phosphorus identified in that shoreline report in 2016. These reports are obviously very labor intensive to collect individual information on every single lot. In a case of a lake with that many lots, I mentioned it took more than 1 year worth of data collection to do so, and it was finished in 2016. So there's been no updates to that documentation. So I don't know whether or not any of those 462 properties have undergone significant redevelopment or shoreline improvements in that time, or how many of them. That's not data that I have at hand, but there's certainly suggestion in the data that I have that there's further phosphorus control that could be done. And it's not possible to put a sediment concentration for phosphorus on what is needed in order for Gliotrichia or Dolichospermum to benefit, nor is it easy to determine if there is even a concentration below which you might limit the algae. But removing phosphorus from those sediments by not having it coming through runoff could certainly benefit the lake in the long term, but that would be a very long-term process in the case of somewhere like 3 Mile Lake, and would likely require other management steps as well. The natural and watershed component of this is 36 or 42%, depending on whether you're in the Hamels Bay or the main basin. So the MECP looked at quantities from individual watersheds, and so that's broken down I haven't covered that in detail here. Andrew Patterson at the MECP looked at individual sub-watersheds and what phosphorus is coming in from those watersheds. Those are much less manageable sources of phosphorus, with the exception perhaps of agricultural catchments. If there's best management practices or something like that can be put in place to reduce phosphorus coming into the lake, there is possibilities there, but the inflowing streams, or you can't block an inflowing stream, that water is going to come into the lake. You can, the management efforts are best focused within the lake on the development that's on the lake itself. Looking at septic systems finally, so the septic system information that I reviewed was from 2006 and 2015 with a brief update in 2019. So the 2006 information was on 521 lots, and it was updated in 2015 for 357 lots. And that ongoing septic inspection had identified and resolved all but 2 issues as of 2019 data. That was, I didn't have the full data. I had summary reports for those septic inspections. So there is an indication that septic system activity on the lake has been improving, but as only 357 of those lots were reassessed in 2015, it's there's at least 150 lots from that 2006 survey that were never reassessed. So it's not clear in the data that I have whether or not there's a need for further septic reassessment, but given the amount of phosphorus that, or the amount of development that's on the lake, the numbers that I presented here are based on a couple of things. So the first number in each of these columns for the main basin and for Hamels Bay is the modeled phosphorus concentration entering the lake from septic systems, assuming that the soil doesn't take up any at all. So that's assuming that 100% of the phosphorus from those tile beds is eventually makes it to the lake. The second number, 33 and 109, is based on the attenuation factor of the model, which is 28%. So that's assuming that 28% of that phosphorus makes it out. So 62% of it stays in the, 72% of it stays in the soil, and the rest makes it eventually to the lake. Now, the peer-reviewed journal science suggests that number could be more like 96%, and so these numbers may overestimate the actual impact of septics, but they do represent, first of all, conditions where you're assuming that these septic systems are functioning properly. So knowing that septic systems is functioning properly is important. And they also assume modern systems. So the paper that's been done recently on septic system function and phosphorus making it to lakes was based on modern septic systems. And this is obviously a lake that's got development that's, some of it is quite old. And so some of those septic systems might be dated. So making sure to control those known phosphorus sources is certainly important. Looking at internal load as the last primary source of phosphorus to the lake, we did review those July 2015 oxygen profiles earlier and showed that internal loading in the main basin is potentially an issue. We also looked at Hamels Bay and showed how strongly anoxic that water was, how much water overlaying the sediment had no oxygen in it. And what that led to in the 2015 data that was available from the MECP, you can see at the top of the water column, they measured 42 micrograms per liter of phosphorus, while at the bottom they measured 90. And so that's indicative of a significant amount of phosphorus that's in the main basin that's actually coming out of the lake. We measured similarly in Hamels Bay during our field trip, 15 micrograms per liter at the surface, while 80 micrograms per liter of phosphorus was in the bottom. So that is a significant phosphorus source. And that phosphorus source and its release is subject to the physical properties of the water column much more than development. So in terms of our lines of evidence for total phosphorus, we don't see a documented increase in phosphorus that directly relates to development. So looking at both the MECP data, the Lake Partner Program data, the District of Muskoka data, the long-term paleo data, there's nothing that we can directly tie in with the data that we have available that connects development on the lake with the algae blooms that began in 2005 and have continued since. So the water temperature from a chemistry perspective, water chemistry perspective is the next thing we looked at, talking about those physical properties of lakes. So this data was a little bit limited because the profile data is collected by the district in Muskoka and has also been collected by the MECP. The district collects late fall. The latest they collect most seasons is August, and that's having to do with student sampling. And students going back to school in September, but we do have August water temperature data from both Hamels Bay and the main basin. Warm water favors cyanobacteria for some of those reasons I indicated earlier. Stronger stratification in a water column reduces mixing. When you do reduce mixing, you're not bringing new nutrients into the water, and the algae that can't keep themselves afloat, like cyanobacteria can, will sink out of that water column, and once they're out of the light, they just die. They have no way to get back up into the water columns. That provides warm water temperatures, and stable water columns provide lots of benefits to cyanobacterial species. The water temperatures in both Hamels Bay and the main basin have increased substantially over the long-term monitoring record that we have available. So you can see that in the particularly everything post 2005, with the exception of one particularly high point in 2002, we do see a very marked increase over time. And the most recent years, the most recent 4 years are 4 of the 5 hottest years on record for water temperature. Directly linking these water temperatures to cyanobacteria, however, is very difficult because these are collected in August and the blooms are not necessarily always occurring in August. We don't have water temperature data that occurs immediately prior to the blooms. We only have spots in time. We only have snapshots in time of what the water temperature is doing in the lake. So in the climate section, I'll try and review some air temperature data and relate that to water temperature and support that. But we do document warmer water within the lake. And so for that reason, we get a check mark. And also we did document internal load. So now I'll look at the weather variables, at the climate variables, starting with air temperature. So I've highlighted 2005, 2015, and 2017. There are other years reviewed in the report, but I wanted to focus on these 3 for the sake of today's presentation. So I'm using air temperature here as a likely proxy for what the water temperature might be doing. So hotter air temperature, we would expect that to translate into warmer water temperature. So we did document prior to the 2005 bloom on this top graph, significantly elevated air temperature that was active for a very extended period of time prior to the bloom. So the gray shaded box here indicates a period prior to the bloom. The blooms occurred based on the information that I have available at the right edge of the graph. So day 265 in this case, which would have been, I'm trying to remember the 2005 bloom, September the 9th, I believe. So we're looking at the conditions prior to the actual bloom, because what we want to do is look at what conditions that aconite germination might have been occurring under, because aconite germination is such a key factor in causing blooms of both Dolichospermum and Gliotritia, both of which occur on 3 Mile Lake. Knowing what the conditions that may have led to that germination is very important. Some evidence from other lakes in the northeastern United States, for example, suggests that up to 50 or more % of the of blooms of those species can be accounted for by aconites that are germinating from the sediments. So understanding how those aconites are germinating is very important. So in 2005, we do see a period of warm temperature relative to the long-term 10-year average. We see that less so in 2015, where we actually have bloom conditions that were delayed. The bloom, so we had basically had an initial report of algae blooms in 2015 earlier in the year, and then the bloom didn't occur until later following the warm period. So we had nearshore growth, but we didn't have a significant bloom until later. And then I think the most interesting of the years of data that we have collected is 2017. In 2017, We have 2 periods based on the stakeholder evidence that were documenting cyanobacteria in the nearshore. This is based on photo evidence. So I have photos from 2 stakeholders that showed nearshore small localized algal growth. So nothing significant, nothing that you would call a bloom. It was like surface algae in the nearshore that was occurring, but there was no bloom in 2017. And in 2017, the bloom didn't occur until the middle of October. And you can see that in 2017, the climate record is quite unique in that air temperature is not elevated, not significantly elevated during that period. It's not until much later in the year, later than in fact usually blooms are usually occurring in this area here. And we don't see any elevated air temperature in 2017 until much later in the year. And relating that to wind speed, in 2017, again, you see that the wind is above the long-term average. So here the red lines are the photos that I have of nearshore algal growth. And we have a drop off in wind that predates those blooms, followed by a period of mixing. And so what we think that, and I mean, in looking at 2005, where the worst surface scum I've ever seen occurred, you have a period of low wind that lasted almost the entirety of the ice-free season. For almost the entire year, wind was below the long-term average. And that was, again, that year where we had that really green surface scum that covered a huge portion of the lake. And so that's very important for aconite germination. And it's a mechanism that we think is driving not only the cyanobacterial blooms in the lake, but when they're occurring and how severely they occur. So in the case of 2017, until you have that calm period followed by mixing, you don't have a cyanobacterial bloom until the green line, which is much later than usual. So the mechanism that we think is occurring in 3 Mile Lake is that nearshore algal growth is a part of sort of inevitable dynamics of lakes. Algae are going to grow into the lakes. Cyanobacterial aconites are in that lake, and so they're waiting for conditions to be ideal. When the air temperature gets warm enough, or the water temperature gets warm enough, those aconites are going to eventually trigger. But it's this period of calm for light penetration, perhaps, for the aconites to germinate and to grow, and then they take up that phosphorus. And there is good evidence that this mixing period is also important. So those algae are growing on the sediment in the near shore, and they need to make their way into the water column. And mixing or entraining those benthic cyanobacteria into the water column, we think is also an important mechanism. And that's what we're showing here in 2017, that period of calm for the cyanobacteria in the benthic environment to grow, where that water will be still and the light can penetrate to the bottom. Cyanobacteria can use that light combined with the nutrients that they're getting from the sediments in order to germinate. And then a period of mixing to take those algae and mix them into the water. And then whether or not you get a surface scum, like in 2005, or don't get a surface scum in 2015, can be very much dependent on the wind conditions, whether or not the wind is calm enough to allow that algae to come to the surface. Looking at the anecdotal information that was gathered in the survey, 3 Mile Lake is a very large lake, and so we had a lot of respondents to the survey, so I haven't put every single quote related to the blooms happening here, but we did have solid evidence throughout most of the replies that answered to this question that suggested long stretches of hot and dry weather, calm weather, predated the blooms on a regular basis. And so that supports the scientific evidence that we have of what is driving these blooms, not only their occurrence, but their timing and potentially their severity, or the surface scum, which I would call severity. So both warmer documented air and documented low wind periods to us suggest climate is obviously very important in driving these blooms. And then looking at the bulk of this information, so these middle check marks where everything has sort of been identified as occurring in 3 Mile Lake, based on that information, We believe that climate variables are the key driver in driving cyanobacterial blooms in Hamels Bay and in the main basin of 3 Mile Lake. It fits with the ecology of the algae species that are blooming. It fits with the data that we've got from the lake, which there's definitely gaps in that data. There's always ways to improve that data, but with the data that we have available, we've documented warmer conditions, calmer conditions, which can enhance the loading of sediment sources. We haven't actually been able to show the enhancement of those sediment sources because we don't have the data for it, but we can assume that that may be possible. So sediment sources of phosphorus, and then these climate factors that are leading to a stable water column are what we believe is the primary drivers of cyanobacteria blooms in 3 Mile Lake. We don't have any evidence that directly links development to the cyanobacteria blooms. That does not necessarily mean that development is not a factor in driving cyanobacteria blooms. It simply means we can't make that connection with the evidence that we have available. The timing doesn't make sense for in the paleo data, and the water chemistry data under the monitoring period during blooms doesn't show any changes. And so without more frequent data of phosphorus in the lake directly related to when blooms are occurring, there's no way for us to directly link development to cyanobacteria blooms. So I kind of just went over this, but just to briefly summarize, air temperature and wind are the main bloom factors that we believe are resulting in and controlling when blooms are occurring. We showed prolonged periods of high temperature and wind prior to the 2005 bloom. The 2017 bloom was delayed, and we believe it's climate factors that delayed that bloom. Dolichospermum resting stages may absorb phosphorus in the sediment, but may also rely on phosphorus sources from the water, more so than Gliotrichia, which has been reviewed for some of the other causation studies that have been underway and for the pilot program study. So it's not to say that phosphorus control on the lake is not worthwhile. There is room for improvement in this area in terms of shoreline buffer development, potentially best management practices in some of the watersheds that the MECP data has shown more loading to be coming from, and those sorts of things. So there's definitely room for management in the lake, but there's no indication that the development on the lake is directly linked to cyanobacterial blooms based on the information we have available. So 3 Mile Lake was the best of so I've done 5 of these studies now, 5 of the 6 that have been done, and the information on 3 Mile Lake in terms of the active blooms and the occurrence of blooms has been the most thorough on 3 Mile Lake, and most of that information has been provided by stakeholders on the lake through photographs and emails and a lot of other information that's been documented. That being said, the way that information is currently being stored is very difficult to work with. So I had to go and look at people's photos and hope that they had, in some cases, had dates on them. And I had to dig through emails to try and reconstruct when the MECP was notified versus when the MECP responded and actually sampled, and try and surmise when the bloom might have actually occurred based on that information. And I think that one of the key missing pieces, and this was identified for Peninsula Lake too, which had very little information on its blooms, particularly the ones that occurred in the 90s. One of the key pieces of information that would be very useful is the kind of documentation that's taking place on 3 Mile already, being collected on a more regional basis and being stored centrally somewhere. I don't want to put anybody on the hook for where this would be, because I know the MECP does document blooms and does have a central repository for information, but I also know that it can be difficult to access that information. And whether or not, but I do know that I think the citizen science aspect of it is important, because you guys are the ones who are living on the lake, and by the time somebody from the MECP or from the district or from a private firm can respond, sometimes these blooms have already gone away. So knowing when those blooms are beginning and knowing where they are starting and knowing how long they're occurring for is as valuable information as you saw in terms of determining the causation of blooms. So I think that a central repository for that kind of information would be very, very valuable. And that might be something that the Lake Association can handle themselves, or something that they can handle in cooperation with the MECP or with the district. Don't want to put too precise a methodology on it. I just think that a better way to store that information is very important. I mentioned this previously, Dolichospermum may draw its phosphorus from the sediment and not the water column, but that is not something that is well established in the literature. And so phosphorus controls in the water column as well as within the sediment are potentially valuable in limiting, if not the occurrence of blooms, then possibly the severity of blooms. It's difficult. There's no peer-reviewed scientific information available that says if you lower sediment phosphorus concentrations below X, then the aconite can't germinate. We don't have that number. That's not a piece of information that's available. But generally speaking, lower phosphorus is going to result in less biomass in the lake. So if your goal is to reduce the biomass in the lake, reducing phosphorus as much as possible is definitely the best way to go about doing that. And based on our review of the phosphorus sources to the lake, the ways to do that are to enact some of the recommendations from the 2016 shoreline report and continue to try and take phosphorus out of the sediment through overland sources from cottages, to ensure that damaged septic systems aren't leaking phosphorus directly as a point source. Another one, to examine the potential for reducing incoming phosphorus in watercourses through BMPs. There is quite a bit of agriculture in the 3 Mile Lake watershed, which is not common in the Muskoka area. So that might be a possible place where enhancing buffers around those agricultural lands could reduce what's coming into those streams and reduce what's coming into the lake. And then ongoing sampling to continue to monitor. From a data that would have been useful perspective, climate data is very difficult. So the climate data was one of the big things that we were missing, and one of the big delays that we had in trying to get the project to completion. And we waited months for data because I was trying to get the best climate data that I could get, which is collected by the ministry. And we ended up having to move forward with an alternate data source in order to bring the project to conclusion, because I wasn't able to receive that data for a variety of reasons, a lot of them in illnesses, COVID, staffing issues. I think there was issues with some of the data collection methodologies, like the Harp Lake Thelma, the ARC that they used to collect data on Harp Lake had problems. So there's lots of different contributing factors to that data not being available. But localized data is very important, particularly climate data. And the reason it's very important is because if you have a forested catchment and are measuring wind speed in that forested catchment, you will have very different wind speed than if you are measuring an open land at an airport 100 meters away. And it's those periods of calm tend to not be as readily apparent in data that's not taken right onto the water. So if there's an interest in collecting enhanced data on 3 Mile Lake, both potentially as an informative tool, but possibly in the future almost as a predictive tool. I could see it almost being used as a predictive tool the way these blooms are occurring. Regional climate data, like right on the lake, which is actually not as expensive as you would think to collect. You can get weather stations that are quite accurate for a few $1,000s. Might be beneficial. It might be something that is an investment for the future. And considerably more expensive than that, but also useful would have been high frequency continuous monitoring data of dissolved oxygen in the main basin, where we would frequently miss that period of anoxia. If we wanted to get an idea of how frequently those are occurring, ideally, if I had a long-term record dating back prior to the blooms of that kind of information, we could see whether or not more frequent anoxic conditions within the main basin have started to occur with climate warming, and see whether or not that is potentially a trigger for the bloom. But those data aren't available, and we can't go back in time and get them. But it could still inform future research on the lake. And there's no doubt that there's future research to be done here. It's a complex system, and even within the peer-reviewed literature, there's not a complete understanding of what is driving cyanobacterial blooms. Everybody thought they had it figured out, but I think they've realized that it's much more complicated than than they believed. I'll turn it over before I lose my voice now to Beverly to wrap up and then be back for questions after she's through. Thank you.
Oh, sorry guys, just a moment. Just frantically monitoring the chat function. So just so everyone knows, I am seeing all your messages. Just all came in a bit quickly at once. So I do have a list of people who are sort of posing questions as we went. So just keep in mind that I'm not ignoring you. I will get back to you in just a moment. For the ones that sent them in the last 5 minutes or so, we are keeping a tally and we are keeping track, and we'll have a few people that are speaking before we get to you. But just know that. Okay, so in terms of next steps, I just wanted to give everyone a heads up of sort of what happens at this phase. Certainly we're having this question and answer period as well, which will be factored into the draft report. In terms of the first step, is we're intending to finalize the draft report based on the stakeholder feedback at this meeting and follow-up discussions with the team. That report will be posted 1 week from today and posted for your comment for a period of 2 weeks. And the plan is, after those comments are done, for us to compile them. If there are comments that need to be addressed in the report specifically, we will do that. Certainly if it has substantial impacts on the overall report. That said, the intent is for most of the comments to be addressed in essentially a separate format, such as an appendix, that these are the comments, these are the responses. That said, we are considering it in the final draft report, but just in terms of getting a report out and not expanding the scope beyond the original scope, that's sort of the format that you can expect in terms of those responses to overall comments. And then once that final report is complete, so the due date for the target due date is January 9th, so early January for that. So then at that point, we will be sending that to the district, and they'll review that with the community planning committee to determine next steps. And then we will likely or potentially be providing that report or recommended next steps to council. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, that council meeting, should it occur, would also be recorded, and then that could be posted as well for your review. So that's sort of the timeline that we're on right now, but I see lots of questions coming in. So please note that we have 2 hours in total for this presentation, but I will be going through the questions sort of as we go. And what I'll do, since there are a number of them, I'll ask you just to let me know if you want me to pose that on your behalf, or if you would just like to pose it verbally. So we'll be going through that list as we go. So we'll go to next slide, please. So I'll start with sort of some of the people that sort of contacted me throughout the presentation. I just didn't want to interrupt Chris while he was presenting his overall questions or his overall results. I will just give individuals an opportunity to repose their questions. I have been tracking as we went. I acknowledge that you were posing your questions throughout the presentation, so your question may have changed. So I'll start with Paul. Paul, are you on the line?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
You had a few sort of throughout the presentation. Do you need me to repeat them, or do you want to just go through the questions that you have now?
No, because Chris did a very thorough job, and I want to compliment him on the approach. Whenever I hear these, I recognize more and more how complicated it is, but I thought his approach of saying what they looked at, what they eliminated, and what they think is the focal point, I found very informative. Just in terms of the report, I think there was a couple of places in there that it was mentioned about shoreline grass. I don't think it should be lost that where that shoreline grass is not owned by cottagers, but it's owned by the district, because the district of Muskoka owns the first 60 feet around the lake now. It's not owned by the Ministry of the Environment anymore. So that's just one observation. But just a question for Chris, because I noticed that the phosphorus peaked in like 1900. There was a huge amount, and I know that there was clear cutting done on Muskoka, on 3 Mile Lake. And I'm just wondering if we're still living from the deposits of the phosphorus that would have been run off from the clear cutting, and if that's providing a rich nutrient. So when the bacteria are basically on the bottom, they basically can just sort of feed away and multiply more. The only other question is, I was glad to hear that you've done 5 studies on that, but I'll put you on the spot. Has there been any follow-ups to correlate your findings to what was implemented and how well they matched?
So I'll tackle the second question first. So the Peninsula Lake study was the pilot study. That's where we developed the weight of evidence framework. That is the lines of evidence that we thought should be considered in order to try and determine the cause of cyanobacteria blooms. After that study was completed, 5 more have been activated since, and they're all ongoing. So there is only a single completed study that has that's been done, and that's the pilot study on Peninsula Lake. In Peninsula Lake, we found very convincing. There's a lot fewer blooms on Peninsula Lake, so there was 93 and 94, if I recall, and then another one in I can't remember now. I think it was 2018 or 2015. Anyway, it was decades later. And we found very strong evidence in the climate data that preceded that 2015 bloom that suggested that the calm winds and the warm water was a factor. So in terms of enacting any policy in order to deal with that, is that what I'm understanding your question is whether or not any action was taken on Peninsula Lake as a result of that causation study?
Well, I just realized there's actually 2 questions. You would come up with recommendations, and then it's going to be up to the district to basically implement any of those changes. And after that, was there any sort of follow-up study to say, this is what was recommended, this is what was actually enacted, and this is the end result?
Yeah, so we did make recommendations both for causation studies moving forward and specific to Peninsula Lake in that report, because there was infrequent blooms on Peninsula Lake with so much time in between them. And because the climate factors were so strongly pointed to for being the cause of those blooms, and because the phosphorus concentrations in Peninsula Lake are so low, I'm struggling to remember exactly, but I believe under 10 micrograms per liter. We didn't make any recommendations to the district as a part of that report for phosphorus control at that time, other than sort of the general lake management practices that are already being done. So shoreline management and that sort of thing in order to prevent worse watershed problems from occurring. To answer the second part of that question, as far as I know, there hasn't been any follow-up study specifically done on Peninsula Lake. There would have been ongoing monitoring done on Peninsula Lake, I'm sure, as part of the long-term lake health program. What if anything has been done with that data, I can't say specifically, but as far as I know, there's no formal follow-up study. Is not a part of the official plan or the causation study process. So I expect that other than looking at the data to see what's happened and continuing to monitor for other water quality issues or further blooms, I think Peninsula Lake at this stage should potentially be removed from the vulnerable lake list because it hasn't had a bloom in 3 years. So, and I've forgotten what your first question is now. What was your first question?
Oh, my first question was around phosphorus in the sediment, and can it be stored? Are we still seeing phosphorus that may have come from a runoff of clear cutting a couple of centuries ago? And is that sort of like a dormant nutrient for when the cyanobacteria are basically just sitting on the bottom of the lake when they're not reproducing to basically contribute silently to the population of the bacteria?
Yeah, so I can't specifically say whether or not the phosphorus that was a result of that clear cutting is still a problem directly, but phosphorus is definitely stored in sediment. when phosphorus is released from that sediment, it's usually released within the top few centimeters of that sediment. For reasons I won't go into. It has to do with pore water and compaction and all sorts of things. So if you release phosphorus from that sediment into an algae bloom, and then that algae dies, some of that phosphorus is going to go back into the sediment. Some of the phosphorus that would have been put into the lake during that clear cutting would have been subsequently buried. It's bound to sediment. It never got released, and it gets buried. Some of it would eventually flush out the lake. This isn't an isolated bathtub, obviously, as we know, right? So there's both water coming in and water going out into Lake Rousseau. So some of that phosphorus would have left. Some of it would have been buried. Whether or not the blooms that are happening right now are a consequence of that pulse of phosphorus that happened in the 1900s, I can't say definitively yes or no with the information that I have available, whether or not without that clear cutting, the phosphorus concentrations in the sediment wouldn't have been sufficient to feed these blooms. There's no way for me to unfortunately, with defensible evidence, there's no way for me to say.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chris.
Okay, so the next question was a request. They had to leave, but they did have a request that I read their question off. So they were just asking, and it kind of, I think you just answered it, so maybe it doesn't need to be answered again, but the main interest is there anything that can be done, or are we living with past impacts such as clear cutting from a couple centuries ago that cannot be mitigated?
Yeah, so I think I partially answered that question. I think that there is certainly things that can be done. It's difficult to, with confidence, say how much impact can be made when something is being controlled so strongly by climate. Reducing the phosphorus concentrations in the lake may not be sufficient to prevent future blooms. What it may be sufficient to do, and I say may because I can't say for certain, but it may be able to reduce the biomass of algae that are in the lake to reduce the severity of the blooms. And then when you've got the climate controlling the frequency of and potentially the timing of the blooms, it's difficult to predict just, on the back of an envelope how that's going to play out into the future. But reducing nutrient concentrations in the lake are generally going to benefit the lake in other areas as well. So shoreline management practices and those sorts of phosphorus reduction techniques are always valuable in lake management, even in lakes that have lower phosphorus concentrations than 3 mile, because it's not just phosphorus you're preventing from entering the lake. It's other things as well, and you're creating habitat for fish, and you're creating recreational environment that's generally healthier. So while the focus of the study is on algae, and cyanobacteria specifically in preventing those blooms, I don't want to downplay the importance of lake management just because it may not eliminate blooms entirely.
Okay. Actually, sorry, they had a follow-up question. Was just they were wondering if it's possible to answer the question of this is the same individual who had to leave. If they were wondering if it's possible to determine the amount of development that is considered a tipping point whereby is causing the problem. I think that's going to be a difficult question to answer, but I do want to at least pose it since he's not on the call and able to explain.
So there's no tipping point that we can identify with the data that we have available. There's no indication in the data that we have available that says that development directly led to the cyanobacterial blooms. The phosphorus increase that we saw as a result of that clear cutting in the paleo data occurred at least 50 years before the first suspected possible bloom, which was that sort of 1943 era bloom that we don't really know with confidence what happened there, other than we see in a long-term paleo record. And a potential increase that may have indicated a period of cyanobacterial blooms or dominance in 43 and then again in 1990. With the going back to the previous two answers, with the phosphorus that would have made it into the lake during that clear cutting period, it's impossible to determine the fate of that phosphorus, how much of it has been buried, how much of it has left the lake through flushing. But it didn't trigger algae blooms in 1900 that we know of in that paleo record. So that's unfortunately the best I can do. If there was a spike in the aconites in the sediment cores that Liz collected that was associated with that pulsing phosphorus that Andrew and the MECP worked on, then we might say this first bloom that occurred that nobody knew about was driven by those development changes and has possibly created the seed bank that is now with climate causing this problem. But we don't have that. And so we can't say that development caused the problem, and we certainly can't establish a tipping point, like number of cottages on the lake above which is caused cyanobacteria blooms, because there's no indication that development has driven the blooms.
There was another person that was sort of commenting through the whole thing. They did ask me to read off their comments, but what I'm going to do is just pause on that, because I think it's better to sort of answer the questions of the people that are on the call, and worst case, we can summarize it if we don't have time to read them off in this particular meeting. So I'll start with John Weekland. I know you had like a general comment originally, but I'll just let you leave that question, and if you need any reminder of what your questions were, just let me know. We do have a record.
No, okay. So just before I ask my question, I just so are you my understanding, I tuned in late, that there was an anomalous algae bloom. Is it 05?
It's the first documented one, yeah.
Right. And one thing I haven't heard in this entire presentation, but I was around then, and there was a lot of people investigating then and talking to the ministry. And everybody I talked to heard that there was a big, skunky, massive, fetid beaver pond at one part of the lake. I can't remember which portion of the lake. I think it was down towards the, I want to say the east wing of the lake. And the ministry negligently cracked that open and dumped the entire fetid beaver pond, which is a huge volume of putrid water, into the lake, and probably full of algae, into the lake at the height of the heat bloom in the summer, at the height of the heat. So I want to know, since obviously you don't want to be negligent and incompetent in doing this report, have you got all of the records from the release? I'm talking the work orders, the timesheets, everything from everybody that did that, witness statements, and confirmed that the ministry dumped a whole bunch of toxic algae into the lake in the middle of a heat wave, because the report would be completely negligent and incomplete and incompetent if that in fact happened and those documents were not in fact included in a chapter of the report. Think about it. I mean, I haven't heard one thing about it in this whole presentation. Now, you may not have known about it. How that could be, I don't know, unless the ministry is suppressing that information because they don't want to get sued. But because everybody's property values had the crap kicked out of them, there was a huge magazine article in Muskoka Life magazine. The headline was, what is wrong with 3 Mile Lake? I can tell you actually the effect it had on me. I was in the middle of a staged builder's loan building my cottage. I had it framed and roofed. And my bank in Nova Scotia cut all my funding. And my wife and I, who are not builders, as you might imagine, literally built our entire 3,000 square foot cottage, plumbing, wiring, and everything else by ourselves, because we got all of our loans cut off because the Bank of Nova Scotia considered our lake almost valueless. So I think the ministry is suppressing their role in that bloom. I think you should dig it up, because if you don't, I will, and I'm a lawyer. And I suggest that if you want to write a complete report, I mean, that may not be, maybe an urban legend. I don't get the impression it was, because we called a lot of people. There was a ministry involvement. So can you please undertake here in front of all of us that you will scour the records, get all those timesheets, go and get all the ministry information, and provide to us in the report all of that stuff. We have a right to see it, because we have a right to have that information, so we know what was done to our lake, to the values of our property by the ministry. And I have another question after that, which is, everybody I've talked to who's been on the lake for and I'm talking like people who are old timers, like the sergeants, people at my end of the road, who have been there for decades, who know there was a dam at the D-Bank River for decades, because the people who are our predecessors on this land were idiots, and they understood that if you want to keep the lake healthy, you have to maintain a reasonable water level, not just go green, green, green and worry about the fish. You also have to keep the water level high enough. And it's irresponsible not to put that dam back. The remnants of the dam are there. It's an historic dam that was there for decades, probably for a century, who knows? That needs to be rebuilt. It was there for a purpose. Our ancestors were a lot smarter than we were, right? And they know that dam needs to be there to maintain the water levels. That's why they built it. So instead of going around in this sort of circle, I won't finish the word, talking about building and development, which I know everybody hates because they're chippy about, Torontonians building mega cottages. Why don't we go back and look at that dam and rebuild it? If you want to leave it open and keep the water level low, Bob's your uncle. But at least you have control. At least if there's a terrible heat wave coming, at least if the ministry sees that the weather patterns or climate change or something is going to cause a bloom or potentially the conditions for a bloom, you can just take out your phone or, go over to the dam and dial it up to like the level that raises the water level 2 feet. Wow, what a solution. It's amazing that 200 years ago, all those original people had the common sense to do that, but somehow it escapes us. Can you undertake to recommend that a dam be rebuilt back where it was supposed to be, where it used to be, so we can regain control over Bloody Lake water level? That's the bloody problem, and everybody knows it.
John, I want to sort of do a comment that maybe Chris can answer. It seems like you're covering a lot of topics, so I just
the dam and the beaver pond. I just want to know, will you undertake to investigate and produce all the ministry's info on the beaver pond, and will you undertake to recommend the rebuilding of the dam? 2 things, only 2.
So okay, so perfect. So then let's start with those 2. Great, thank you. Yeah, so let's start with those. Let's see if Chris can, I mean, there was a lot of stuff that was said there that I'm not sure Chris can address, but he can certainly talk about whether those were factored into the study and what his recommendations are. So I'll let him do that first. Okay.
Yeah, let's let Chris answer. That's great, Bev. Thanks. Let's let Chris answer. Thanks.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. I'll start by unpacking the hostility, which is not necessary and shouldn't be directed at me, and the threats of legal action. So based upon those, I'm not going to answer your question. If I'm being threatened with legal action based upon the answer to my question, I'm going to skip over your question. I'll say this, I was provided the data that I reviewed by the district. The district gathered that data from the ministry sources, from their own sources. I was given that data and I reviewed the data that I was given. That I'm being accused of negligence or stupidity on this call is not something that I expected to see. And the beaver pond release was not information that I was provided. And I can't recommend, based on the data and the scope of my study, that dams be built. And I'll leave it at that at this stage and leave it for your comments on the report and my discussions with the district on how to deal with those comments. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to go to the next individual that was on the list from the presentation. So it was Phil. That's some questions about Phil Shantz. Are you on the line? Did you want to pose your questions directly?
Yeah, sure. If you go back to slide 26, can Chris explain the difference between the 2 land use categories? One says overland runoff cottage, overland runoff other. 44% of the phosphorus concentration appears to be from the other, but I don't know what is the difference.
So it's going to be specifically to cottage development would be actual residential cottages. Other would be anything from resorts, camps, cities, and major urban areas such as that. So it would basically be anything that's not cottages that's considered urban area on the lake based on land use mapping and GIS software. So that's how those 2 are parsed out. So other is sort of a capturing category for development on the lake that's not necessarily a residential cottage, but might be marinas would be another example. Because there's different expected phosphorus loads from those 2 categories. Cottages tend to be lower in their phosphorus load for runoff than other urban areas, because other urban areas tend to be more streets and concrete and paved area and even less impervious surface than a cottage.
Okay, that's fine. That seems to be an important conclusion. I mean, we obviously don't have urban areas around 3 Mile Lake. This is really just talking about a small number of commercial sites. Okay, I think my second question, you already essentially answered, where you're pointing out that the climatological influences are really the driver in terms of the frequency of the blooms and their severity. I mean, I would, the question is would phosphorus reduction really reduce the frequency and severity of the blooms, and how much phosphorus reduction do we actually have to do to reduce the number of blooms? I recognize that's a hard question that we really can't answer that. So I think you've addressed it. So
Okay. Yeah, it's difficult to put a number on that, which is what I was trying to get at with the recommendations. I never want to recommend that phosphorus control isn't valuable, but it's very difficult, particularly with blooms that rely on phosphorus from the sediment, to say what level of phosphorus reduction would be necessary in order to reduce the severity or the frequency of blooms, or if with the seed bank that's established, if it's even possible. It's just not something we have the information to directly answer.
yeah, no, that's fine. That's clear enough. I think I'm fine.
Thanks so much. Next one was an anonymous. They asked that it be asked anonymously, so I will answer that question. Just a second. Has the impact of stern lowered wake boat activity in shallow depth sections of the lake been qualified? And if not, is it on the radar?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Has the impact, and I can type it to you too if that's easier, Chris.
No, just read it. Just read it.
Okay, has the impact of stern lowered wake boat activity in shallow depth sections of the lake been quantified? And if not, is it on the radar?
I
Is
would
it on
need
your radar,
data.
I guess? Is it
Yeah,
on the radar of the
on
municipality?
my radar. So
Yeah.
I know boating impacts is something that has been mentioned in some of these studies, and certainly in shallow waters on the western part of the lake, particularly where the water isn't in many cases much more than 2 meters deep. Wave action from boating can stir up, can push waves, which when they hit shore can stir up sediment, and that can certainly entrain cyanobacteria or entrain sediment into the water column. And I know that that's a concern that a lot of people have demonstrated. So it's not, unfortunately, something that we can quantify because I don't have any information on boat use and how boat use is, more importantly, how boat use might have changed over time. So in order to quantify something, we would need the numbers in order to do that quantification. So we would need an indication of not only what boating activity is now, but we would need an indication of what boating activity was prior to these blooms occurring, because it's that comparison of during the bloom events versus not during the bloom events that allow us to determine the importance of that individual variable. And so it's unfortunately something that's outside the scope of the study because I don't have the data available for it. Doing research on boating and the impact of boating on the lake may be very interesting, given its shallowness, but is unfortunately far outside what is possible with the scope that we had.
Okay. Is that okay? So that was an anonymous question, so I'll leave that. Leanne, you had asked to be added to the list. I'm guessing ask a question, but just let me know if that's not the case. Leanne Smith, are you on the phone?
Yes, I'm here, and you had asked if I wanted to be included in your list of people who have interest.
Excellent.
That's what I was
Gotcha.
looking
No
for.
worries.
Thank
Just
you.
wanted to clarify that if you had
Great.
like a specific question. All right,
Yeah,
perfect.
no, thank you.
No problem. Next one was from James. James, did you want to ask your question directly, or did the last response answer your question? I'll pose it to you, Chris. It's just, what about boats? Surfing behind ski boats is now very common, but I think you answered that question. I think
Yeah, it's essentially the same answer.
Yeah. To that point, like if I'm reading some of these out because I don't know, so some of you are sending me message saying, hey, like I'd like to ask a question. If you can raise your hand, it makes it a little bit easier because I'm sort of monitoring as well as. So I'm going through as quickly as I can, but if you want to raise your hand, that also helps me. There was a question of, did you use data from Louise? I'm not sure what that is, but Louise. Is that a person? Is that
It's a
Suzanne?
ministry. It's a ministry
Ministry, okay.
of the environment monitoring station,
Okay.
similar to Thelma. They named them Thelma and Louise because they're clever and hilarious.
Okay.
I looked at all of the data that was sent to me by the Ministry of the Environment. Not all of it made it into the presentation because some of it showed the same information that was shown by other data that was already being presented. So in the interest of not showing the same figure 5 or 6 times, I might not have included it. Whether or not Louise data was specifically in what the ministry sent over, when I communicated with the ministry at the beginning of the project, they told me that they had sent everything that they had. So I believe that I have everything that they had, and that I've reviewed everything that they had. And that's the best answer that I can give to that question.
Okay. This was a general question. I'll let you answer it. The question is, what is a BMP?
Best management practice. I apologize. That was abbreviated but not spelled out. So best management practices are generally just based on scientific knowledge of controlling phosphorus and other pollutants that might make it into a river or a lake. What sort of things can we put in place? So that would be, when we talk about BMPs, we would be talking about like a buffer that would absorb nutrients and other things from runoff before it gets to the lake, or limit runoff to lake. Those kinds of things are BMPs. There's also BMPs in development. The best management practice, another one would be like this sort of the setbacks that you would have on lakes for where your septic system should go and that kind of thing.
Okay. Next question I had was from Jane. Jane, did you want to ask your question directly, or do you want me to just read comments you've included?
I can ask it. I just I guess I just had the 2 questions. One of them you answered already, which is like, what is the likelihood that the township will consider stormwater management? Because we see a dramatic amount of runoff come through our property. We have a creek that comes through our property off of North Shore Road. Like, it's disgusting sometimes, the water that comes through there. It's got, in the middle of the summer, it dries out and it's all red and algae, and like, so I don't feel like it's very clean, the water that comes down through our property. So, and you had suggested that as part of the load. So is that something that townships are actually considering?
I can't speak directly to what the township is considering. Does anybody from the district want to answer that question?
I mean, I can answer from a planning perspective. There's requirements for addressing stormwater management from development proposals, but I'll let Elizabeth give more details on the specifics in the region. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Beverly. So in terms of site-specific stormwater management, it is up to the township when they would request drainage or stormwater management plans for development. My understanding is typically lower tiers don't normally request it for small scale development. However, if there's extenuating circumstances, they can ask for it. Well, they can kind of ask for it at any time if they're the Planning Act process, or through the building permit if applicable. That's definitely something, a comment we can take back to the township and get some further information on. And I'm not sure if Beverly mentioned it, but after the meeting, we will be collecting all the comments and creating sort of a detailed response chart. So we can for sure include this and provide some additional information at that time once we have a chance to chat with our lower tier peers about it.
Okay. I mean, that's fine. We'll leave it for that. The other is just, can you describe the toxins that are in the algae we have? With this summer's bloom, there was a comment that they don't generate dangerous toxins, that there's not a lot of the cyanotoxin in it. I just wondered if you would be able to comment on that.
Yes, I can. So typically those blooms are measured for, if there is a bloom, the MECP measures for microcystin and for anatoxin. And so the literature information that I have at hand on those cyanobacteria and those toxins suggests that Gliotrichia particularly tends to be at the low end in terms of its toxin production. So how much toxin a equal biomass of cyanobacteria produces is generally lower in Gliotrichia than it is in some other cyanobacterial species that tend to occur in higher nutrient lakes, which is one of those other reasons why controlling nutrients is valuable. Because if you shift from getting Gliotrichia or Anabina blooms every year to getting Microcystis blooms every year, you could see an increase in toxins, an increase in beach closures and that kind of thing. So Gliotrichia is generally low. And what I know of Dolichospermum is that it varies, and in some cases, these things can vary between individual, like DNA identified sort of subspecies of the cyanobacteria. Dolichospermum is also on the lower end relative to some of the others. So as far as toxins in blooms goes, in the MECP data, I have not seen in most cases, with a couple of exceptions from the blooms that I've reviewed on 3 Mile Lake, toxins tend to be below detection, and I believe in all cases are below like the World Health Organization's drinking water guidelines, which isn't to say that they're not a problem. It's just to say that they're not necessarily an immediate threat. A lot of that data has been collected from some of the blooms that are not necessarily surface scums. So if you're swimming in one of those surface scums like we saw in 2005, those toxins are going to be much more concentrated in what you're actually swimming in, which is why they issue warnings for drinking water and that sort of thing as a precaution. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And my dog thanks you too.
So I do see Dex and Paul. I'm just working through the remaining comments that sort of came before your hands, but I will call on you shortly because I do acknowledge that you're both waiting to answer your questions. So the next question was from Judy. Judy, did you want to ask your question directly, or did you want me to just read it off?
Sure, no, I'll ask.
Perfect.
You indicated that a significant portion of the runoff is from other, which for us in this lake is a lot of farming community. And I'm wondering how much influence can we have on those owners in trying to reduce their runoff?
So that's a difficult question for me to answer. Influencing agricultural policies would be done through, as I said, trying to implement best management practices. It's possible that you might be able to get support through the district or cooperate with farmers in order to try and encourage those sorts of buffers. But again, that's a question that's probably not a science question and better answered by the planners at the district in terms of what steps they think that they could take if exploring those options were to move forward, or what influence they could exert.
You want to take a stab at it? Go ahead.
Sort of, unfortunately, like the stormwater management question, as it kind of all relates into it. That kind of site control would really be at the township level. So again, I can get a little bit more information from the township and provided in our formal comment response that will be forthcoming. But I definitely recognize it's a bit difficult. I mean, when, especially like at the provincial policy level, when talking about agricultural lands that's not usually adjacent to large water bodies. So runoff is, I would say, a little less impactful than what we see in Muskoka for sure from the agricultural uses that predominantly exist in Muskoka Lakes. So I can definitely get some information in talking to the township and provide that as a follow-up.
That would be great, because I mean, recognizing that the majority of our shoreline is cottages. There's this huge oversupply of the runoff, with 40% being from other.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know there's, some on-site mitigation measures that waterfront properties can do, but I recognize that I'm sure it's quite frustrating to hear that it would have to be put on you to mitigate external properties. So I completely understand that. And I'll look into it more and compile that response for you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll get to one more and then I'll get to you and Dex and Paul. There's a fair number of comments, so I just want to, since your hands are up, make sure that you get a chance to speak, because I'm not clear if all of these want to speak directly to their comments. But to start, Susan, you had asked a question, Susan Walker, a while back, and I hadn't given you the opportunity to speak to that. So I wondered if you wanted to now, or if you just want me to pose the question that you had written down. Susan? So since I'm not hearing from her, I'll just say it. So what do you need to see attribute to, it says pH, but I'm thinking total phosphorus loading to development, septic system, shoreline alteration. So I think she's asking, what would you see if you were to attribute it to development? Like, what would you be looking for if development were the cause? Yeah.
I would be looking for a change in nutrients that is timed such that it indicates that it could have been a trigger for the blooms. So the first bloom, like I said, was in 2005. And the previous potential incidents of cyanobacterial dominance were 1943 and 1990, based on the paleo record. The phosphorus increase, the only one that we see that can be attributed to development, occurred in that very early period between 1860 and 1900. So what I would be looking for would be an increase in phosphorus that preceded cyanobacterial blooms.
Does that, I didn't hear from her, so I'll assume that's the answer to the question, but Susan, if you have additional questions, just let us know. So I'll send you in now. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, so it is Susan Walker speaking, sorry.
No worries.
I was muted. I guess, does the district have a definition of development? Or if they do, what, and then do we know what the definition is?
I think there's two questions there. Maybe it's what Chris is defining as development when he says what he's looking for. And then I think there's greater questions about development overall. So maybe I'll let Chris answer that question first, what he was referring to. And then I assume Elizabeth may want to hop in on the remaining of it. Yeah.
Oh, well, Elizabeth activated her mic. I think she wants to say something, so I'll let Elizabeth go.
Okay.
Thank you. So development is defined by the provincial policy statement from a planning perspective. So I'm just pulling up the PPS for you now so I can read you the actual definition that us in the planning department go by. So I don't know if Chris has a less, planning perspective from what he would denote as development, but I am just pulling it up right now. So 1 second.
While you're doing that, this is Susan's husband speaking, and one of the factors included in that definition in the provincial policy statement is the creation of new lots. That can constitute development. The change in land use can constitute development. My question in that connection is, did you consider lot creation data over the years in forming your opinion as to whether development was a principal contributor to the blooms?
That one I can answer. So I had data on 2008 and 2018 on the vulnerable lakes, the lakes on the vulnerable list from the district that had lot counts on it. and changes in lot counts on it between those two time periods. I also had lot counts from the model, which is 1997 based lot counts. And I had the sort of background knowledge of when that land clearance occurred on the lake related to the paleo data that we've been talking about throughout. In comparing those numbers, the lot counts actually go down over time on the lake. So the lot count numbers that I received go down between the model in 1997 and then 2008 and then again in 2018. So because those lot counts are going down, the model that you put those lot counts into would assume less phosphorus based on the way that the model functions as a mass balance model. So that's the development data that I had. And so that's the development data that I worked with when I was looking at what phosphorus changes might have occurred.
Thank you.
And just from the provincial policy statement perspective, development is the creation of new lots, change in land use, or the construction of buildings and structures requiring approval under the Planning Act. It doesn't include activities that create or maintain infrastructure authorized under an environmental assessment process, work subject to the Drainage Act, or parts of mineral mining.
I think I should clarify, like it's new development typically, so it's not typically existing development under the Planning Act, because those are considered permitted already. If that helps clarify.
Let's get to Dex's question. He's had his hand up for about 25 or 30 minutes now. So
yes, thank you very much. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks for letting me speak. I own a cottage on the lake, and I mean, I have to tell you with all due respect, guys, since 2005, I think we've been spinning our wheels here, and I haven't seen any improvement in this algae bloom. In fact, this summer was one of the worst that I've seen, maybe not visually, but the stench was incredible. I swim in there, my kids swim in there, other people swim in there. I don't see any kind of progress here at all. But one thing that I did notice from your own data is that the phosphorus level has been there for a long time. Maybe it goes up and down a little bit, but I don't think we're going to get rid of phosphorus. And I don't think that phosphorus really contributes to the bloom. It's highly likely, and it makes sense that it's the temperature that's doing it. And I can see that the temperature of the lake is going up and up all the time. So to hear that increasing the water level is not the cause, I don't know how you can conclude that, because obviously if you increase the water level, the temperature of the lake would go down and you would possibly be preventing the bloom. Maybe you can just explain to me, you know, as a scientist, I'm a scientist as well, how you see that the water level increase would not have any effect on the blooms, because I think the blooms are really what's the problem here.
So your question is, you don't think total phosphorus has anything to do with the blooms, and that it's being driven by climate, which I agree with. That was our findings as well. We believe that climate is the mitigating factor in driving the blooms. But what I'm not clear about is I didn't make any conclusions based upon the lake level. So I'm not, you might be putting words in my mouth a little bit there in terms of the lake level not being a factor.
Yeah, sorry, you did say earlier that you cannot conclude that increasing the water level would make a difference to the bloom. Yeah, I heard you say that, because I think it was John that made that comment about the dam. And you said that that would not, you know, alleviate the problem. But I mean, how can we say that? Because it directly would increase the temperature of the lake. Actually decrease it.
I didn't, I'm sorry, but I don't think that I said that. In response to that question, I said that I don't have any information on water level that I can use to recommend building a dam, is I believe what I said. So I'm not sure that I can answer your question directly, but if you could pose it as part of the review process, and we'll review it in the appendix in the comment when I have more time to unpack it, rather than trying to answer it off the cuff. I think that might be beneficial. Leave it with me and let me look into it in more detail.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just would like to see some results, guys, because I know a lot of effort goes into doing these analysis, but year after year, there is no improvement. Thank you.
To your comment, I'm gonna mute you. Okay, perfect. And Paul, I know your hand was up as well, so I'll unmute you now.
Yeah, well, just a couple of quick comments. We've had algae blooms since I came up here in '69, so it wasn't until 2005 that was actually identified as a toxin issue. So it's a long ongoing thing. And just on the dam, they, from what I understand, they tried to build a dam there in the 50s, and they didn't because they couldn't get consensus on the lake as to what the level should be maintained at. I would also have concerns about the ecology downstream from the dam and reducing water stream down to Rasa, what that would do. But I wanted to just comment on the question about toxins because that's a very complicated one. And I'll ask Chris to keep me honest here because the early studies, especially from the WHO, in terms of allowable toxin levels was based upon, I think, a 200-pound male drinking a couple of gallons of toxic water. They now seem to be coming out with guidance around less mass and with children. I have not heard of any fatalities, human fatalities in toxins. They occur in animals and in livestock. So in 2005, our dog developed a liver problem, which we attributed to her drinking and potentially eating algae that was coming out of the lake. One of the things that public health does not emphasize, which I think they're missing, is that if you are taking your water from the lake, the act of either pumping it or trying to disinfect it with either chlorine or UV will actually increase the toxicity of what you're actually drinking. So I would encourage anybody who's interested to do their own research because it keeps being updated, but they're not really telling us too much from public health.
I can confirm you're right about the animals and livestock. Certainly, animals and livestock are much more susceptible to cyanobacterial toxins. If by nothing else, by virtue of the fact that they must drink a lot more water than people do, and children being of smaller biomass or smaller body mass are also more likely to get sick from the water than adults.
Okay. Does that answer your, well, at least help answer some of those comments? Is that Paul? Okay. So it is 12 o'clock now. We had a few hours for the meeting. I haven't gotten through all the comments that are provided because there's a fair amount that came in fairly quickly. That said, if everyone is okay on our team, just giving an extra 5 minutes in case there's a last minute question that needs to be posed right now. Alternatively, we do have all of your comments and questions in the chat function. And so we will be recording and can provide additional responses with the release of the report. But I'll sort of pose that to the district of how much time we can add just to allow for last minute questions if we do have any. So what I would suggest is if you have any.
Bev, if you've got the questions already documented, Bev, why don't you we can include them as part of the appendix with the review comments that are gonna come in from the report anyway.
Yeah.
I'm gonna lose my voice pretty soon, so.
Yeah, I recognize there's a lot in writing, so I didn't know if there's anyone who wanted final, like, not in writing comments. Alternatively, feel free to just post your question right now. We do have a record of all of this. So I'll leave it open for a few more minutes so that you can add it in, and then what we'll do is include that in the response. Okay. And additionally, we are posting the draft response or the draft report in 1 week again. So it will be open for 2 weeks. So maybe take a moment, collect any other concerns that you might have, and then feel free to submit your comments in those 2 weeks. So with that, I will just say I'm not seeing any quick hands. So so I just wanted to say thank you for coming, for your comments, for your questions. We are very appreciative. This is all items that we review and take a look at when producing the final report. And with that, I'll leave it to Cassie to close out the meeting, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Beverly, and thanks, Chris, for the great presentation. I think we all learned a lot today about 3 Mile Lake. Thanks, everyone, for your time again this morning. Great discussion, great questions, and also for your effort and interest throughout this entire project. So we look forward to your further comments if you have any, and also to the final report. So thanks again, everyone, and take care.